Hey there, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Sandbox Seeding 101 for admins. We're going to be diving into the best ways to get test data into your sandboxes. We are going to give it about a minute before we get started, let some more people join, and then we'll jump in. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started today. Before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes. Attendees are going to be on mute. If you have a question, you can answer it in ask it in the chat or raise your hand. We will be recording. You'll be getting a copy tomorrow. And again, just to stress, we will have a period for questions at the end, so please ask all your questions throughout. We're not ignoring you. We're just going to answer them all at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. First up is Jay Manning, Director of Sales Engineering at Prodly, and we also have Christine Marshall, Salesforce MVP and Course Director at Salesforce Ben. So I will hand it off to you two, and we can go ahead and get started.
Helps if I unmute myself. Christine, go ahead. I'll jump in behind you.
Thank you, Jay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christine Marshall. I'm the Courses Director at Salesforce Ben. I'm also a Salesforce MVP and a user group leader, and I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about sandbox seeding. It really is a very interesting topic.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and again, thank you everyone for being here today. I am Jeremiah, as you can see my name up there, but I go by Jay for that very reason, Manning. I direct up solution engineering at Prodly. Prior to that, I spent about a decade at Conga, and prior to that, I was the classic accidental admin IT guy. Hey, guess what? We bought Salesforce. Go learn Salesforce. So I've gone through that track in my career as well. We're looking forward to today's session. As Joe mentioned, please put your questions in there. We will get to them at the end for sure. So really, why we're here today, and you'll notice for the audience here that Christine and I will do a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussions. She's been around the ecosystem, I've been around the ecosystem, but we're really talking about the importance of testing in Salesforce Sandboxes and how this really wraps itself into all of the good things we should be doing in Salesforce. Sandbox seeding, testing, the right kind of releases, all those kind of things are going to come up today, but we're going to spend a lot of time on testing in Salesforce, where, who, how do we do that? It's going to be most of today's session. So really jumping in to this is kind of what is the testing process? And I know there's a lot of words up here. There's too many words for a slide. I'm aware of that as well, but there's a lot of differences when you talk about just the word testing in Salesforce here. You know, regression testing, integration, your end-to-end security, performance. There's a lot of things up here to do, a lot of different people that are involved in this as well. And, you know, maybe the one thing in here, that third note on here, something very specific to Salesforce, right? And Christine, this is the classic, how do we get our Apex? How do we get our old triggers in there? Test code coverage, right? So this one, we were forced to do, right? Salesforce was making us do this right here. But we got end-to-end testing, visual security, performance. I mean, Christine, is there anything up here that I was missing? Any bullet points that I didn't make on the list?
No, I don't think so. I think this really covers all the stages of testing. And I think what's interesting about this is how much as admins we are having to learn and participate where maybe historically we haven't. And if you are a solo admin, as I was, a lot of this can seem very, very intimidating and a bit like, what's it got to do with me? I'm an admin, I use clicks, not code. Do I have to do all this testing? Is this relevant to me? And the answer is yes.
It is, absolutely, because when your users get something and it's not working, it becomes very relevant very quickly to you. So kind of brings me to the next one, the who slide, right? You talked about a single admin involved in the process. I talked about this as a little note over here, that all the people involved, the people doing the work, the people reviewing the work. Now, this may be for a more sophisticated or larger group, where you get to the point where you can divide some of this labor, some of these responsibilities up. But we're really talking about everybody involved, the doers, the reviewers, the approvers, and the users here. This is everybody that's involved in testing. And typically, I don't know, Christine, if it was the same for you, but most of this was getting done in production for me. Is that kind of the feeling? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Historically, I think, especially as admins, where we haven't needed to worry so much about test coverage, people have been building in production. I'm guilty of it, but Salesforce gets more complicated with every single release. The tools at our disposal get more powerful, more complex, and there are more consequences. And one of the things that we spoke about, Jay, was Flow Builder. It's as powerful as code under the hood, but unlike code, you don't have to push it from a sandbox or a dev org into production. You can build it in production, and that is potentially quite dangerous. So as admins, it's even more important than ever that we get on board with using the right kind of test environment and then pushing our changes into production once they've been thoroughly tested.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I go so far back with Salesforce that the product object wasn't even included with Professional Edition right there. So you talk about the evolution in complexity that Salesforce has done. It's gone declarative, clicks not code. Hey, guess what? Now you can write your own Apex, write your own triggers. So it got a little more complex, a little more dev heavy. And now we're seeing that transition back in a way to configuration, record-based configuration applications. And that really ties into why sandbox seeding and shift left testing and development is so important today. Here's a typical use case. Everyone's pretty familiar with what's going on here. Your sandbox environments, the ones you're given, I put that in quotes here, from Salesforce versus the ones you may have to purchase. A full, a partial, maybe some dev pro, some scratch orgs, some developer ones that are there. These are the environments that Salesforce intends for you to use to do testing. I'll be honest with you, and most of the people I work with, a lot of the work to the testing and a lot of the work in terms of the development too is done in that far left box right now, the full copy. Christine, we've done this. We've either done it in production or you do it somewhere in full. There's a lot of benefits to a full sandbox. Now, when you were doing this, and we've got a little bit of a teaser coming up here, but just to tease it, when you were doing some of this work, where were you doing most of your work, Christine? And we'll open it up to the audience.
Wherever I could in a full sandbox. I loved a full sandbox, and I didn't always have one. So when I worked at a company that had a full sandbox, it was like all my dreams had come true. I could use templates, and it had all of my data in it, real data. I thought it was brilliant. And as an admin, didn't appreciate that actually, just because it's all singing or dancing, has all the bells and whistles, it's not designed for each stage of your testing.
Right. Now, it's not all rainbows and butterflies with the full copy sandbox here. It's great. There are certain things you have to use it for. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into this. But opening up this same question to the audience here, I know we've got a little poll coming. We've got some people behind the scenes here. It's going to take over real quick. Opening up this poll. So where does work get done in your Salesforce environment, your hierarchy right now? We'll give it like 45 seconds. Go ahead and drop your answer in there. We'll talk a little bit about those results when they pop up. I can tell you anecdotally where most of it's getting done from the people I'm talking to on the day-to-day, but curious for the audience here, what's going on? I like that Scratch Org made the list too. Salesforce is really pushing that. I'll talk a little bit about those and the benefits and maybe some of the pitfalls too as we go throughout this presentation today.
I think it will be interesting, Jay, to see how many people do select Scratch Org, especially since our webinar today is primarily aimed at admins, and Scratch Orgs are not something that we typically use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit about them, but this is good to see. So let's just kind of starting at the top there, that 6% of production. I get it. I've done it. It's probably a little bit higher. If we think about all the little tweaks we can do in Salesforce, right? We can make a little tiny change in there that we don't think is really development. Christine, I know you've got a little other notice we talked about before, but maybe 4% is a number you saw as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a similar poll on LinkedIn, and about 4% of the respondents said they were building in production. And if I'm honest, I don't believe it. I honestly think there's a lot more happening in production, and maybe people just don't realize that the changes they're doing constitute as changes. You know, a little field here, a little tweak to a validation rule there. There's still things that should be done in a sandbox.
Yep, absolutely. And full and partial, it's good to see that actually that much is being used in a partial. Sometimes they're overlooked. You're given some data in there. It's got a bigger footprint, more data can have. It can be missing some records. We'll talk about the effect of missing one or two records and a false positive. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Full copy, pretty traditional in there. Usually multiple people working in the same full copy. That has its own issues. But I think I'm most happy to see that 42%, nearly half, are working in those lower environments that are down there. That's best practice. We'll talk about why maybe that isn't 60 or 70% in just a moment. Some of the issues that come with this, but I appreciate the insight from everybody there. Any last comments on this before I move back in?
No, I think that's been a fascinating insight, and perhaps I'm wrong. You know, building in production, very similar to our LinkedIn poll. Perhaps I'm just jaded, or I'm thinking of my own bad behavior.
And maybe I'm projecting myself right back from the day when I did everything in production at the time. So the traditional kind of development process here that we're looking at, dev pro, scratch orgs down there, they've got their own pieces that this is really best practice. How should we move our work along our environment, our stream, our life cycle, whatever you want to call this here? Lower level environments, whatever that means to you, typically into a partial or some sort of integration. Maybe you do some testing in there. You probably should, right? Test early, test often. You're going to hear that more than once today. Moved on to that full copy where you do that full testing. You've got all of your integrations built out. You've got all your different work streams coming in a multi-dev, a multi-admin environment. And then finally picking out those things to release to production. That's what we're looking at here. Traditionally, if we look at the two blue boxes, that's usually what people are using. And even if you saw, if you were to add up full and partial as where work is getting done, that would have been about the audience as well, the poll results. So here's what we're talking about mostly today. Shift left development, best practice. This is not Prodly, and again, I work for Prodly, right? I'm not going to hide that from anybody, but this is not Prodly's approach. This is Salesforce's approach to how to do development. There are benefits here. There are numerous ones. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to do. We have to do a lot of work to get it to go there. But in an ideal world, Christine, if you were doing the day-to-day, right? If you were still wearing this hat and you've got a group of people, this is where you would want to be, right? I know it's a leading question, maybe rhetorical, but this is the ideal here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is what we want people to be able to do. Now we'll talk about some of these things. I want to highlight that this is a more mature or sophisticated approach to doing development. But maturity and sophistication, they're not synonymous with complexity. It doesn't have to be difficult here. There's a lot of solutions in the market that are going to make it more complex. That's not what I'm talking about today. This is maturity. This is doing it the right way. You can add a lot of weight in terms of rigorous processes, long training, rigorous onboarding, long time to implement to your entire overall development process. That's not what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about a quick win. How do we do what's on the screen right now quickly? Why do we do this? Why it is important here. So what is shift left testing? Honestly, it's just that top of bullet point. Test earlier, test often, right? There's things that I can do, my team can do. Builders should be testing in their own individual environments earlier. Test early, test often. I told you you're going to hear it more than once. You're not going to hear it the last time right there. You avoid bugs getting into staging in UAT environments. If you identify it earlier, you can fix it earlier. And Christine, do me a favor here and talk about maybe that middle one here, the term builders, right? That's kind of generic. I don't mean developers, I don't mean admins. What does that mean to you when you were doing some of this day to day? Who was involved in that builders piece that's here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we spoke about this when we were, developing this session, because we talked about users, people that use sandboxes, and terminology wise, we felt like that wasn't the right phrase to use, because
Right.
when you're a Salesforce professional, users are your end users. So we talked about using builders because that can represent anybody that is building on the Salesforce platform, whether you are an administrator, whether you're a developer or an architect, you're a builder on Salesforce.
Right. And what a cool platform it is, right? I could talk Salesforce shop all day. I am a big Salesforce nerd under the hood. I've been around a long time. And the idea that you can open up the development process, generic term development process, to a whole audience, a whole range of different skill sets, different technical expertise levels here. You're still going to want to give them the ability to go and do that work somewhere where they can honestly play around. It's called a sandbox because that's where we go as kids to play around. And at the end of the day, that sandbox is going to be there for you tomorrow as well, no matter what you do to it. Some of the benefits here, and this is an interesting one. When you start to sophisticate, get more mature, maybe the group grows a little bit. Do you know what changes are being made in your sandboxes here? I struggled with this. As soon as I brought a couple people under me at my first job, I didn't know what was going on anymore. And Christine, it's easy when it's just one of us. Well, easy is not the right term. At least we know what's happening most of the time when it's us. But did you ever get to the point where you had a few people that were working with you here? How did you separate the work? How did you know what was going on? Or did you? No, maybe you didn't there.
So it's difficult because I did have people that were using like sandbox environments that I had, and they weren't administrators, I would call them super users,
Yep.
but they were, testing in sandbox environments, and they had extra privileges. And it's one of the issues that we can talk about later, is what can potentially happen with sandboxes when you're sharing access, things like accidental refreshes.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly becomes a lot harder to track who's done what. And actually what I found was I had to be very restrictive about privileges, because I had people making changes in the back end, and I was going through the system audit trail to find out what had gone on. So it is very difficult. As you say, one of the joys of being a solo admin is you are the sort of king of your castle, and if anything goes wrong, it's much easier to troubleshoot because you broke it. So you can track back your own steps. But that's another reason why, sandbox seeding and DevOps become so important, because you have, you get into things like version control and figuring out who did what.
Right. And it's funny, you talked about those super users, right? Those power users, those business analysts, whoever you give more access to. And in a full sandbox, it's got your data from production. What happens if some of that data isn't visible to them in production, but then you give them some extra rights in that full sandbox? All of a sudden, they've got same access to that data that's in production in a spot where they otherwise maybe shouldn't have there. So you talk about personal identifiable information. How do you know who has access to what in different environments? The importance of masking your data so it's representative, not exact, in those other environments where other people have higher level rights than they normally would have. Really get into the problem with testing in dev sandboxes today. A lot of people were using them. I saw Dev and Dev Pro, I think 42% was the poll result that was there. That's great. Maybe a question I would have followed up on right after this, to be honest with you, is how are you getting the information into those sandboxes? Because this is what it comes down to. There's no data in those lower level ones that exist. It's got an asterisk there, but it doesn't populate any with an asterisk data in there. Okay, you get your products, you get your price books, you get your price book entries. I realize that. But there's no way to test how the change will affect your production level data in those lower level environments. No good way out of the box with Salesforce. DevOps says the best practice is to use a dev role for changes, but how do we get it in there? How do we get the data in there? How do we work with those? I'm actually going to ask you now, jumping ahead a little bit, Christine, when you were trying to get data into one of those, or if you would right now, kind of what would it look like? How hard would that be? What processes would you go about to get something into a dev or a dev pro?
An absolute nightmare, to be quite frank. So as we said, there's none of your real data, and you've got all the storage limitations as well. So you can only have a certain amount of data, and there are third-party type products that generate dummy data. You know, Mr. Donald Duck.
Right.
And you can download spreadsheets and upload those. So some things I tried was taking data out of my production, you're using a report or data loader and then re-importing it. But then you need to preserve relationships. You end up with too much data. You could try using dummy data, as I just said, but that's not meaningful to people. And one thing that I've really found is if you're trying to do any sort of user acceptance testing, they need to be testing on their own data, and it needs to be the most recent data. Otherwise, you're just dealing with questions of this opportunity isn't there, or this account doesn't exist, or it's not the same. And then the other thing, when I had super users testing, sometimes, they'd be like, how can I get data? And I'd be like, well, create an account, create a contact, create an opportunity, which was not met with great joy.
And our users, especially our sales users, I love them. Thank you for what you do. I've been in the sales organization for a long time across multiple companies here, but they are creatures of habit. If they're looking for a record, that one record, and it's not there, that will be the tunnel they have. That will be the only thing that they see in there. And honestly, data loading, it's more of an exercise in how good are you with VLOOKUP functions. That's what it comes down to. I did a demo for my sales team here of 4 objects: accounts, contacts, cases, opportunities. I showed them, and I actually titled that video "To the Pain." A little bit of a Princess Bride throwback, right? I titled that video "To the Pain" right there so they could go and see what you actually have to do. A little note on scratch orgs. They apply down there as well. Salesforce loves them. They are pushing them. They want people to go to them. They also don't have any data. In fact, they're one level worse maybe because their metadata doesn't even match your production environment. We'll talk about a little bit of solution to that later, but same thing applies to those scratch orgs as the lower level environments. Some other considerations to talk about here: compliance, right? In a world where people's identifiable information is a precious commodity and must be prevented, you must take control of that so people don't have access to it where they shouldn't. Where is that data right now? Again, if you're in a full sandbox and it's not masked, you've got your data in there. You've got those power users, Christine, you were talking about, who have access to records they otherwise wouldn't. It's a consideration you have to take under your own mind here.
I mean, I experienced that in my last role as an admin. We dealt with very sensitive data. We were working on things like aerospace and defense.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was also a company that used one instance of Salesforce for like 3 different companies who shouldn't see each other's data. So there was a lot of complex security to try and ensure that people didn't have access to certain information.
And boy, that's the sharing rules that go onto an org like that become crazy to manage. So good on you and the teams and any admins that are managing that kind of thing. So we talked a little bit about this, but that's critical in here. GDPR, California here, all the regulations that go along with proving out that somebody doesn't have access to something they otherwise shouldn't have. And then auditing, you talked about this too. Just to highlight again, who's making changes? Who has access to data? Can you run the reports? Can you prove that changes are happening to your environment that should happen? How do you relate this to work management pieces here? So again, let me ask you one question on this. In your day-to-day when you were doing this, how are you tracking all of the requests coming in? How do you know what was actually getting done and getting pushed in, Christine?
With great difficulty, and I tried various different options. I even built a solution in Salesforce. I used cases as native functionality for people to log their requests so that I could mark off what had been done and what hadn't been done. I tried spreadsheets, but I'm as guilty as everyone else for really playing down minor changes. So I wasn't keeping track of the small things, a pick list option here or a new field there. Maybe I've renamed something. And so I wasn't tracking everything.
Yeah, pick list values, right? So easy to go in and add a new pick list value. That changes data, that changes the type of data, changes reporting, changes business process. Now, why do I use this value? All those questions come up with such a simple change that are here. So test data workarounds, we talked about the data load conundrum, right? If you want to get really good at VLOOKUP, you data load. That's what you do. That's not the only option here. The push and pray one, and we talked about this as a group when we were putting this slide together. I like this one here. I like a little humor that comes in at this time. Let's just hope it works. This is the roll the dice, roll a 5, maybe you'll get a Yahtzee here. Ooh, I'm showing my age when I bring that one up. But what is it? Again, throw caution to the wind, deploy, change, trusting it will work once in production or staging. Now, I've done this. Christine, I'm not going to talk for you, but I'm sure you've done this before. Everybody here has probably done this.
Yes.
Maybe talk about some of the problems. Yeah, and I'm going to turn this over. The problems are laid out on the screen, but some of the things you may have run into when you've done this approach.
Missing. I'm always something missing from like a change set, for example, building a change set, not putting everything in there, or putting too much in has also been an issue before, where I was trying to find related components that also needed to be deployed, and I accidentally put too many in, and I actually overwrote things that had been updated in production, and the changes had literally happened in the last 24 hours, but I didn't know,
Right.
and I overwrote them.
Yeah, and it happens, toe stepping, overwriting things. This bottom one here is an interesting one. This is the false positive piece. Sometimes you can push a change, to production with a change set or some other mechanism here, and that change is successful, right? It validates, it deploys, but you could be missing a component if it's not a true hard related piece. Anybody out there who might be using Salesforce CPQ, that's a great one here. You can push a price rule that doesn't have everything. You can push a bundle that may be missing an option. It's going to look great. You're going to go data load that or rebuild it by hand. That's incomplete. That's not a successful push. Even Conga, again, Conga Composer solutions are chock full of little subcomponents that are there. Missing one of those will create an incomplete solution. It could be as bad as not having the right signer if you're sending something out for a signature. So those kind of things can happen there, the push and pray. Do your work in the full partial copy sandbox? Sure. This is a communal sandbox. This is the most typical one here. Multiple people working in the same environment. That environment is typically stale and old, right? The main reason why we don't refresh our full and partial sandboxes is because, and you've talked about this, we don't know what's going on in there. And if you hit the refresh button, you may blow someone else's work. Or, as happened to you, Christine, if somebody else hits that refresh button, what happens to you?
Yeah, and it actually has happened to me. It's devastating. I mean, obviously there are limitations with sandboxes, how often you can refresh them. And as we've said, when we're user acceptance testing, we need up-to-date data to really get that adoption and that buy-in for successful testing. But I once built out an entire solution in a sandbox. It took about 2 months, and one of my super users didn't really understand what a sandbox was or what would happen if you press that refresh button, and so he did, and he completely erased all of that work which had to be rebuilt. It was one of those situations where I couldn't even cry. I was so horrified and broken.
There's no recovery. It is a full rebuild in that one. And that's time you're not spent working on the next project for your stakeholders. Yeah. So the bottom one here, hey, how about an extra full copy or an extra partial? That's great if you want another 15 or 20 or 30% on your Salesforce annual contract renewal. They're expensive. We're going to use those other free, again, not a line item under contract one to do some of this work. The data loader problem, we've talked about this. It's time consuming. You downloaded data, you have to upload it, the relationship management piece. All of that data from production now sitting in a spreadsheet on your computer or on the network too, unprotected, visible to some other users that may not have the ability to see it. And there's no clear audit trail of that data coming in or going back out. It's here. I don't want to harp on this. I could spend an entire session just showing you data loader. Everyone's done it here. Nobody wants to see that pain again. Kind of another thing that's popped up here, a theme more recent in the ecosystem is, what about your disaster recovery solutions? Big fan of disaster recovery, it's critical. What happens if Salesforce goes down, your instance gets corrupted? That is a horrible thought to have, but what if it does? Disaster recovery is here. I don't know, Christine, this kind of came along after I was an admin. Did you ever do any disaster recovery? Did you ever have any of the systems in place for this? I'm just curious for you specifically?
Well, it's funny that we talk about the cost of extra sandboxes, full and partial sandboxes, that it can be prohibitively expensive. And that doesn't have to be a problem if you're using your dev sandboxes. You know, it's it work out. But I think the same can apply to data backup and recovery services. A lot of businesses don't want to spend more, and they tend to be relatively expensive solutions. So a lot of admins, I think a lot of companies are relying on more native features. One of those is in fact using a sandbox, which is not recommended, and also using the native data export service. You get all CSVs, but in the event of a disaster, you're in exactly the same problem as that previous slide where we talked about data loader. You've got to get that data back in, which
Yep.
Yeah, it can be an absolute nightmare. So historically, I have used the data export service. Luckily, never had to put the data back in.
This is something people usually get because they're told to do it. This is a regulatory compliance thing. Hey, we need disaster recovery. All you do is cross your fingers and hope you never have to use it to get the data back in. That's the point here. So a little bit again, I'm going to turn it over to the audience here and talk about this. So kind of behind the scenes here, the man behind the curtain, a little bit of a poll here. So what methods have you used to get test data in your sandboxes? So same ones we just went through here, and then we'll take a look at a couple more, and I'll show you a solution that we really prefer. But what have you done to date? I have my thoughts about what the answer is going to look like, but I'm curious to see what the audience says here. I'm looking.
Do you have a hunch on what it would be, Jay?
I sure do. I don't want to see the answer right there, but I am fairly certain I know where the curve is going to be on this poll result. All right, let me take a look here. I have to open it up a little bit too. Yeah, I figured, well, that's a lot of numbers. That's more than 100%. I love a poll that comes back with a higher, I think it was multi-selection there it was. So this is not what anything out of the norm, what I thought it was going to be. It's use those full and partial because there's data, and use data loader, right? Christine, any shock here to you?
No, not at all. I felt like it would be mostly do the work in a full or partial copy sandbox.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's where we did most of our work. We saw it before. That's what we do when we get our data in there because it's got the data to do our work against. Okay, let's not spend too much time here. Thank you again for the answers to the group right there. And we'll move a couple along. So what does work? Well, we talk about sandbox seeding, right? You can't shift left testing. We can't shift left development without having those environments to work in right now. Sandbox seeding. Christine, I think you dropped the term earliest at the beginning of the demo here. This is what we're talking about here. It makes development best practices possible. It also handles all the things we talked about before. How do you mask that data? How do you divide labor and separate duties? How do you stop from stepping on each other's toes? I've worked in environments where multiple people are on the same one, and I never know if I'm working on something somebody else might be working on at the same time. So we're removing all of these issues here. This is best practice. Your production data, maybe you're full, whatever's got good data in there, preferably production, use it to push data down, whatever that means to you, into your Scratch Sandbox developer environments down here. Also, right, keeping in, you talked about 200 megs in a dev. I think a gig in a dev pro. Don't push too much data. It can't handle that. This is what it is. Production data pushed down, masked, randomized, maintain those relationships without the burden of doing it by hand into these environments here. How does this work? This is probably the largest one here in terms of words on it, but if you just look at it logically, where's the data now? What do you need to do with that data? Where does the data need to go, right? There's a lot here. There's objects, there's what data do you need, selecting relevant data, selecting the right amount of data. Maybe the most important thing in here is the second point in the middle under seed, repeatability. If you're using data loader, if you're using refreshing your full sandbox, that's not a repeatable process, right? I think I think the issue with that is you don't know what work is being done. You can only do it a certain number of days. That data gets stale. That data gets old. There really isn't a whole lot more to talk to, but this is how it works. Workable production level data, a micro environment of your production in your lower level environments. That's what it is. I think that's a majority of the pieces here. I don't want to gloss over how important this is, but just be conscious of where's the data now, what data do you need, how much, what do you need to do with that data, and where does that data need to go? I have a tendency to oversimplify, but Christine, before I jump in and show a little bit on a different screen, anything I'm missing here or anything to highlight before I do a bit of a show and tell piece?
Well, I'm thrilled at the people who are joining us today, especially if they are admins, because I don't feel that that term sandbox seeding means enough to enough admins yet. I think there's some confusion about who is this for, and the assumption is that sandbox seeding is for developers, but it's absolutely not. And I think the best way to explain why it's relevant to admins is to talk a little bit about the use cases. So,
Right.
for example, we should be building, testing, amending our flows in a developer environment. But with things like automation that are processing lots and lots of records at once, you want data. You need data. It's no good just testing it on 1 record or 10 records. You need to be testing it on hundreds of records. And then the second use case that really stands out to me is training. So we can build anything, and it can be as beautiful and as intelligent and as wonderful as you like. But unless you have buy-in from your users, you have good adoption, it's all meaningless. And the way to get buy-in, I think, when you're releasing new functionality is to do user acceptance testing, is to do training with your end users, and that must be with real data, real time, real data that's relevant to them, so that they can understand what's in it for them, how it works, see how it affects their current data. And that's where I think sandbox seeding is incredible for admins, because up until now, we've really not had a scalable way to get real data into test environments.
And repeatability, scalability, economies of scale. It's hard to do. It's time consuming. A lot of times it's easier just to do it in full, do it in production because of the time it would take. And I get it. I've done it. We're still doing it today. I probably have done some things I shouldn't in production as well. So let's spend a little time here talking about this. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes. I'm going to try and keep myself to that and look at a solution to this, kind of Prodly solution to what this looks like. Repeatability, scalability, time, speed is what this is about. So I'm going to bring over a different browser over here. It's something I never like doing live, but there we go. As the screen catches up, you're going to see me doing this piece in Salesforce. I'm actually going to stop my video just for the time being for a little more bandwidth as I run through this a little more quicker, a little more click heavy. I'm in Salesforce. You're going to notice it, dashboards, reporting. This is how you know what's going on in your environments. We talked about how do I get an audit trail. At the end of the day, we're talking about environment management. These are my environments. These are my dev sandboxes. I'm using a solution like Prodly, so I've got a lot of dev environments. Dev Pro, my partial, my full sandbox would be in my umbrella, my hierarchy here. If I need to add an environment, I'm going to jump in and just for show, I was spinning this one up earlier today, kind of no smoke and mirrors today. Spun up a new sandbox. Thankfully, Salesforce got me that preview box within about an hour and a half today. But just to show you, that one will be here. I'm going to cheat and get the username because the most difficult part is sometimes grabbing the username out of here. It's my dev 4, my dev 5. Maybe you got a new project going on. Just going to grab a username. And I'm going to add this real quick. So this is dev 5. Production sandbox scratch org. We talked about those. This is the sandbox. Hit the add environment. Very simple to do. This is the answering the question of where. Where is the data now? Where does the data need to go? I'll log in. Hopefully I can type. And it's going to go through. It's going to add this environment. Now I've got a brand new sandbox that has my metadata that is up to date as of about 30 minutes ago. I can then go and push that data in there. The data I want to push is self-defined. It's user-defined. Whatever's relevant. The record number, again, remember, relevant data, masked data, and the right amount of data. And that is a byproduct of something Prodly calls, don't worry about the jargon, a data set. This is just our version of a schema. This is just the relationships, the data, the records you want us to have in there. I've got a simple sales and service cloud. Remember, this is not about complexity. This is for all the projects we're working on. If this is a new flow to automatically create a renewal opportunity when I've closed one, that's based upon records. You're going to want a lot of opportunities. Those opportunities are going to have accounts. Those accounts should have contacts. You should have a fully fleshed out set of data you want to use. You should also mask that data, randomize names, make email addresses invalid. Tell us what records you want. If you only need 200 of them because you're going to a very low level environment, just tell Prodly how many records you want. Ultimately, it lets you build with a point and click interface the data that matters to you. Accounts with parent accounts, the contacts, the cases, the case comments. I'm going to pause here. If you were doing this with Data Loader by hand or even a script, if you've got developers out there building data creation scripts, this is a significant amount of work. It's going to take you longer to seed your sandbox with this data than to go in and build what you're building right now. So this is the kind of thing you can do, just defining what objects, what relationships are involved. When we go in and take a look here at the contact object, you're going to see that I have the ability to just leave things like the birth date behind. That data is too identifiable. The email address, I'm going to tuck .invalid so I don't accidentally email a bunch of people out of my sandbox. I'm going to randomize the first name. I'm going to randomize the last name, but I'm still going to maintain all those relationships. This is the idea of representative data, not exact data that's here. So let's go ahead and push all of this data down into that new dev sandbox that's in there. If I want to do that to more than one, maybe I've spun up 5 or 6, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. If you're doing that one at a time with Data Loader, that's an unbelievable amount of work. But we get in and use Prodly, tell us where the data is, and I'll push that same data down to 5 at the same time in parallel. So if I want my data to come from production, and I want to push it into my new Dev 5 environment here, here's my data, all those objects, all those relationships. Here's how you start to track who's doing what. So seed for project, whatever it is. Maybe you're using Jira, Agile Accelerator, some of the other work management platforms. Start to tie your deployments while you're doing these things to your work item, your issue, and deploy that data. Prodly is going to take care of everything. It's going to know the order of operations. It's going to know the reparenting. It's going to put everything back together and randomize all that data you want us to. One fell swoop. That data is not ever saved in an Excel file. That data is not visible in its full capacity anywhere. It's just going to push data in there, give users credentials to that sandbox, let them go in and start their project. So seeding for the project, it's going to kick off. It's going to run through all of that data that's going through there. Maybe you've got a use case where some of the metadatas, you've got an old sandbox that's there, that's stale. There's new stuff in production. If you want to push some metadata down and not refresh that sandbox, Prodly can help out a little bit here as well. This is the idea of actually seeding that sandbox with some changes that may be a little bit in front of your production. It's a release ahead from the metadata side. But today we're really talking about how do we get that data into those environments? How do we do it quickly? How do we do it effectively? And that's where a solution like Prodly comes in. What data? How much of it? What needs to be masked? Where is it now? And where does it need to go? We'll kick that off. This finishes here in about 12 minutes. What would otherwise be a 4-hour data load exercise. And it's going to be data that is up to date right now, this moment in time. Again, when you're done, you'll have full visibility into all the deployments you've done, who's doing what, with what, where, when. That's the idea. New sandboxes, start your project, get the data that's relevant into there. When that piece is done, push your changes up, test your changes in that dev sandbox, right? You're going to have records in there to test your flow, test your changes, test your pick list, test your new record type that's in there, building new records and kicking off any flows from that record type. Push it into an integration box, do your testing there again with more changes, multiple work streams, push it into UAT for your users. Maybe that's full, maybe that's the partial. When you're done, you're going to feel good because you've tested that 2 or 3 times before you release that to production. I know that was a very quick overview, but that's the idea. Environments, relationships, data, Where does it need to go and which records need to be pushed? So I did it, I guess I did it in about 8 minutes there. I kept myself to 10, I did it in about 8. There's a lot more under the hood, but that's the sandbox seeding principle and why we would do something like that. So as we get into kind of, this, and we've got questions out there. I know I've got the chat flashing, I've got some questions in the panel, but really what Prodly is doing here is sandbox seeding, data migration, think CPQ again, or Salesforce billing, field service lightning, even the Conga technologies or other technologies that are built application configuration record heavy. You're going to make changes at the record level. That's going to change your configuration. You're going to want an easy way to migrate and implement and manage those record heavy applications that are here. Sandbox seeding, data migration, implementations, and release management for CPQ. High performer, fastest implementation. I had people up and running in hours, not weeks, not months. That's the idea that's here. A little bit of a teaser here if you want to know a little bit more and really get into the weeds as it comes to CPQ implementation. Best practices, the webinar course starting on May 25th. There'll be a link to sign up in the chat. I think somebody just dropped that link in there. We're really going to dig in. You're going to get more of me, so forgive me up front, but we're going to talk about how to do this. What are the best practices? Thing to think of prior, during the build, at release, UAT, ongoing management. It really is that kind of full implementation best practices course, really from lessons that we've learned, I've learned, that other people in the ecosystem have learned along this part. I'm pretty sure it's in the chat right there. If not, take a look for it. We'll definitely get it in there for you. Questions. Now, I know there's a whole bunch. I actually haven't looked at it. I've tried to avoid the questions, but I think, Christine, you've taken a look as I went through the demo there. What have you got for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a reminder, there's still time. So if you have any questions about sandbox seeding or anything that we've covered today, then please do put those questions in the chat now so we can answer them. But there are a couple of questions. Great. So let's say, for example, that we are doing some development and we're pushing our changes and we've gone from our dev orgs into our partial or our full sandbox, but we've been a bit delayed. So the data that we pushed in before has now gone a bit stale. Can we push a fresh set of data into a sandbox like our full or our partial without overwriting any of the changes that we might have made in there to the metadata?
Yeah, that's great. So traditionally, right, you'd have to hit the refresh button. That's the crux of the question right there, is how do I get the data that's meaningful? You hit refresh, you blow away the metadata you were talking about. So a solution here would let you essentially keep, almost in real time if you wanted to, sync at the data level between production data and that full and that partial. So instead of hitting the refresh button, let Prodly go in and just bring in the data from the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes last few months. You haven't refreshed that sandbox in quite a while, but absolutely can go in and push those test records down there and not have to have somebody hit that refresh button and lose all their work. That's a great use case, great question out there.
I think, we just have to be realistic with the greatest of intentions. Projects often don't run on time. There are often delays or, last minute changes that have to be pushed through. I think a question that comes up watching this from people would be, could they use dev sandboxes and sandbox seeding to replace their full copy sandbox, or the need for a full copy sandbox?
So this is, all right, and this is me putting my solution architect hat on. I'm going to give you a yes and a no, right? A good engineer is always going to give you the yes and the no at the same time. The idea is absolutely, if you're using specifically a Dev Pro with a little bit more room for data, you could make that a true micro environment of production, right? Full is a full environment of production, but you could get every object in there. You could get a subset of records from every object that's in there. There are many times where a full sandbox specifically is important. Some third-party integrations are going to require, think ERP, think your billing systems that are on the back end. they are going to, if not require, strongly recommend you do your testing against a full sandbox in Salesforce. But at the end of the day, you can leverage those Dev and Dev Pro as a true small environment. So maybe instead of buying that full or that second partial, maybe try to leverage those lower level environments in a way because you can get your data in there. And really, you're just looking for places for people to go in and do work with the relevant data where they can kick that off and test it earlier. So that's a good question there. I'm never going to discount the power of a full or a partial, but maybe that second or third or fourth full, maybe take a different look at a better way to do some of those sandboxes.
Thank you, Jay. And
Yeah.
just a thought from me when watching the demo there, it feels like Prodly's platform has been designed with admins in mind, which I find quite interesting because, as we've said, historically, maybe sandbox seeding hasn't been something that admins have been doing. But I loved the fact that it looked very simple, very guided. So would you say that this is suitable for admins? It's declarative, no need to know code to be able to use Sandbox.
No. So Prodly was built from and for Salesforce experience, a Salesforce solution for Salesforce admins. That's where we've come from. That's what we were born from. Still to this day, we do everything making sure that we haven't forgot, honestly, an audience that is doing more development. This is something when we did our first webinar together, Christine, we talked about Salesforce admins are doing Salesforce development. It's just never been called that. So how do we bring them a solution that is a developer solution, but is tailor built for their experience in Salesforce, on Salesforce, for Salesforce, with a Salesforce user in mind? Yeah.
They're great. I love how intuitive it is and how simple. We've got some other questions that are coming in from the audience.
Perfect.
Daniel has said, as a senior admin, it scares me that some of my newer admins have the ability to deploy to certain environments.
Sure.
How can he control their access? What are the sort of security controls that are in place?
So remember that built on Salesforce I just talked about? That first screen I showed everybody, those environment cards that are there, those are built on Salesforce records. Those Salesforce records have sharing rules built in. You can prevent different users, profiles, groups, individual users, whatever sharing rule, and I'm talking an actual Salesforce sharing rule here, you can prevent users from seeing an environment at all. And then you can actually go one level further. You can prevent users from having the ability to make it a source or a destination. So in my example I showed you there, I was the release manager. I have full access to everything right now. I'm the one admin, I'm the Prodly admin, I'm a release manager. I've got another user in that same environment that when they click on production, the only option they see is use as source. The only thing they can do is push data from that environment down. Standard Salesforce sharing rules, another benefit of being built on the platform.
And then we have a question from Sarita to do with CPQ data deployment.
Yeah.
Can I get all related object data from production to Sandbox? And the second part of the question, can I even move data from Sandbox to production?
Absolutely. We have something we call a deployment plan. Again, don't get lost in the Prodly jargon. A deployment plan is one or more data sets. I showed you a data set that had simple data, accounts, contacts, cases in there. CPQ, 50 some odd configuration objects, well over 80, 100 relationships that are there. Prodly has something we call a release template that is all of CPQ baked in. You click a button, 20 seconds later, you can push all of CPQ into a sandbox. I'll tell you right now, that process finishes in between 45 and about 75 minutes. Now you've got CPQ in a dev sandbox. You go and build your changes, and then Prodly can be used to push those record changes back up and promoting it back up the change. Cross-stream, downstream, upstream. It doesn't matter where you need the data to go. It just matters where the data is, what the data is, and tell us where that data needs to go. That was a great question, Sarita. Thank you.
So finally then, if anyone on the call wants to learn more about Sandbox or Prodly, where can they go to find out more information?
I think we have, I'm not sure actually what the next slide is here. Is that a thank you slide here? Prodly.co, that's our website. I think my contact information probably is out there somewhere. If not, look me up, look up Prodly in LinkedIn, look myself up directly. But yeah, get in touch with us. Prodly.co. That's our website. That's the best place to get in touch with us. I'll sit there and talk shop all day long with you. If you just want to talk about, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm thinking, I'm just trying to do Salesforce a little bit better, we'll get in touch with you. I'm not going to pressure you into something you may or may not need. I just want to know where you are right now, what you're looking to do. Probably may have a solution to help you. We may not. But either way, don't hesitate. Reach out. Get in contact with us. I think probably behind the scenes, we're dropping a few more links maybe into the chat as well. Best way to get a hold of us is there. We'll get you out. We'll reach out. We'll get in touch with you. And I really look forward to hearing from some of the people on the webinar today and from the recording. Some of the people maybe couldn't have made it today. So thank you.
We'll be sending out that content, some follow-up link in our email tomorrow.
That's perfect. I want to say thank you to the audience here. We're about 5 minutes before. I will hang out. If there's a little bit, I'll kind of put myself on pause. Anything else that comes in, let us know. But I truly appreciate, Christine, thank you again. It was great doing something with you. And thank you to the audience and all the attendees as well.
Thank you for having me, Jay.